A Virginia plantation demolition crew in 1961 uncovers a sealed underground chamber beneath a collapsed stable, too precisely engineered to be accidental. Infrared analysis of surviving brickwork reveals a construction signature traceable to a single enslaved stable hand named in only one document, a plantation inventory from 1850. The chamber's ventilation system, water channel, and disguised chimney flue reveal a mind of extraordinary technical discipline operating in total secrecy. 12 families sheltered there across 2 consecutive winters, leaving behind objects that tell their story in fragments. The man who built it was never recorded as having escaped, never recorded as having been punished. He simply vanished from the record in the spring of 1852, as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. The foreman's name was Gerald Pitts, and he had demolished 43 buildings in his career without finding anything that made him stop walking. On the morning of March 7th, 1961, that changed. His crew had been contracted to clear a derelict estate 12 miles outside Culpeper, Virginia, a property that had passed through 6 owners since the Civil War and had been uninhabited for the better part of 2 decades. The main house was already down. The smokehouse, the root cellar, the carriage structure, all reduced to rubble and loaded onto flatbed trucks by Wednesday afternoon. What remained was the stable, a low, long building of post and beam construction, its roof long since collapsed inward, its walls leaning at the cautious angle of something that had decided to fall slowly. Pitts had allocated 4 hours for it. He would not finish until the following morning. The first sign was the sound. One of his workers, a man named Clarence Webb, was operating a skid loader along the stable's eastern wall when the machine's left front tire dropped 6 inches without warning. Webb cut the engine. The 2 men stood at the edge of a depression in the earthen floor and listened. Pitts dropped a loose brick into the gap. It did not land the way bricks land on soil. There was a hollow interval, brief, unmistakable, before the impact. Beneath the stable floor there was open space. It took the crew 3 hours to clear enough debris to expose the entry point. What they found was not a root cellar, not a drainage basin, not a collapsed well. It was a rectangular chamber, 11 feet wide and 22 feet long, with a ceiling height of 5 feet 8 inches, tall enough for a person of average height to stand with a slight bow of the head. The walls were brick, not fieldstone, not packed earth, not salvaged timber. Brick, laid in a modified Flemish bond pattern with a consistency that Gerald Pitts, who had spent 30 years in construction, would later describe to a Richmond newspaper as being cleaner than most professional brickwork he had supervised in the 1950s. The mortar joints were uniform to within 1/8 of an inch across the entire structure. Someone had measured. Someone had planned. The chamber had no door in the conventional sense. Entry was through a timber-framed hatch in the floor, 22 inches by 31 inches, hinged from below and counterweighted with a sandbag system so that it could be raised silently by a single hand. Above the hatch, the stable's original flooring, wide pine planks, each one 12 inches across, had been relaid so precisely over the opening that the seam was invisible unless you knew to look for it at a specific angle of afternoon light. Pitts would later say he had walked across it 3 times before Webb's machine found the edge. Inside the chamber, the crew found the following: 17 fragments of wool blanket, too deteriorated to identify color, but retaining enough fiber structure to establish weight. Heavy winter-grade wool, not the thin Osnaburg distributed to enslaved workers on Virginia plantations in the antebellum period. 4 ceramic vessels, 2 intact, 2 cracked along a single fault line each, of a type consistent with domestic kitchen storage from the 1840s and 1850s. A child's leather shoe, right foot only, size consistent with a child between 4 and 6 years of age. 3 short lengths of tallow candle, melted flat against a narrow brick shelf built into the north wall at seated height. And a single object that would take researchers 11 years to fully understand. A small flat piece of pine board, 6 inches by 4 inches, on which someone had pressed a pattern of shallow indentations using what appeared to be a nail point. Not random marks, but arranged in careful rows with consistent spacing between groups, in a system that bore no resemblance to any English letter or number. Gerald Pitts photographed the chamber with a Brownie camera he kept in his truck for documenting job sites. He reported the discovery to the county sheriff's office. A deputy came out, walked through the chamber, wrote 4 sentences in a notebook, and told Pitts to finish the demolition. The photographs Pitts took that morning, 11 images on a single roll of black and white film, sat in a shoebox in his daughter's attic in Fredericksburg for 31 years. They were not seen by a researcher until 1992. To understand what that chamber represented, you have to understand the landscape it was hidden inside. The Culpeper Basin in the 1840s and 1850s was not the deep south of popular imagination. No endless cotton fields, no Spanish moss, no vast river plantations. It was a different kind of difficult. The farms here were mid-sized operations running between 800 and 2,400 acres, producing wheat, corn, and tobacco through the labor of between 20 and 90 enslaved people per property. The terrain was rolling and wooded, cut through by creeks, and bounded by the Blue Ridge to the west. Geography that made it simultaneously easier to hide in and harder to move through than the flat coastal regions further south. The Rappahannock River ran 20 miles to the east. The Shenandoah Valley began 30 miles to the west. Between those 2 landmarks, several thousand enslaved people lived and worked in a landscape that their enslavers knew intimately, and that they themselves were legally forbidden to navigate without written permission. The property in question, recorded in Culpeper County deed books as the Harlan Burwell Estate, encompassed 1,340 acres in 1850. The Burwell family had held the land since 1791. By the time of the 1850 slave schedule, the estate was worked by 34 enslaved people, ranging in age from an infant of less than 1 year to a man recorded as being approximately 60 years of age. None of them were identified by name in the schedule itself. Federal slave schedules of that era recorded only age, sex, and a physical description. To find names, you had to cross-reference against plantation records, letters, account books, work logs, the occasional diary entry. For the Burwell estate, one such document survived. It is a single-page labor inventory dated October 1850, held today in the collection of the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond. It lists 31 individuals by first name, age, assigned task, and a brief physical description. 30 of those names can be cross-referenced against the federal schedule without difficulty. The 31st entry is the one that matters. His name, as recorded, was Silas. He was listed as being approximately 32 years of age. His assigned task was recorded as stable and grounds. His physical description consisted of 4 words: tall, left-handed, scar chin. There was no surname, as was standard. There was no notation of skill level, no record of purchase price, no indication of where he had come from before the Burwell estate. He was a man reduced, on paper, to 4 words and a task. What the inventory did not record, and what no document in the Burwell family archive recorded, was that Silas had been constructing something beneath that stable for an indeterminate period before October 1850. Something that required precise knowledge of masonry, hydrology, ventilation physics, and human concealment, using materials that should not have been in his possession, in a location that his enslavers walked over every day without suspecting what lay beneath their feet. The question that researchers would spend decades attempting to answer was simple. Where did he learn to do it? The brick itself is the first clue. When archaeologists from the University of Virginia conducted a formal survey of the chamber in 1993, the first professional excavation of the site, delayed 32 years by the indifference of a county sheriff and the slow movement of academic attention, they identified 3 distinct brick types within the structure. The majority, approximately 2,200 of the estimated 3,000 bricks used in construction, were standard Virginia common brick of the type produced at small regional kilns throughout the Piedmont in the 1830s and 1840s. Their dimensions, 8.5 inches by 4 inches by 2.5 inches, matched production records from 2 kilns operating within 12 miles of the Burwell estate during that period. These bricks were unremarkable. They were also, according to every Burwell family account book the researchers could locate, unaccounted for. The estate's brick expenditures for the period 1845 to 1852 showed purchases consistent with chimney maintenance and a new smokehouse constructed in 1847. They did not show a purchase of 2,200 bricks for any recorded purpose. Those bricks had to have come from somewhere. They had to have moved in darkness, in quantities small enough never to attract attention, over a period that the archaeologists estimated, based on the mortar curing signatures visible in the wall cross-sections, at no less than 3 years, and possibly as many as 5. The second brick type, approximately 600 units, concentrated in the chamber's ventilation system and north wall, was different in composition. The clay mixture contained a higher proportion of iron oxide, giving these bricks a darker, more reddish cast. This formulation was characteristic of bricks produced at a specific type of plantation kiln, a small operation, typically run by enslaved labor, producing bricks for local estate use rather than commercial sale. There was no plantation kiln recorded in any Burwell family document. But there was something else. 4 miles north of the Burwell estate, the 1850 slave schedule recorded a neighboring property, the Ashby Farm, that listed among its enslaved workers 2 men designated in its own labor inventory as brick and lime work. A third population of bricks, the remaining 200 or so units, used primarily in the chamber floor and the counterweight housing for the entry hatch, showed evidence of having been salvaged and relaid. Several bore partial maker's marks from a Fredericksburg commercial kiln active in the 1820s. They were old bricks, sourced from somewhere on the estate itself, probably from a structure that had been demolished or had partially collapsed. Nobody had noticed they were gone. Nobody had been watching a stable hand count bricks. The third clue was the ventilation system, and it was the detail that stopped every engineer and architect who examined the chamber's remains. Two narrow shafts, each approximately 5 inches in diameter, rose from the chamber's ceiling at opposing ends of the long axis. They did not rise vertically. They rose at a calculated angle, 23 degrees from vertical, the archaeologists measured, before connecting to what appeared to be an existing drainage channel running beneath the stable yard. The shafts were lined with ceramic pipe sections, the type used for agricultural drainage, and their upper terminations were positioned directly beneath a section of the stable's exterior wall, where surface water runoff would naturally pool after rain. To anyone examining the stable yard from outside, the ventilation outlets looked like drainage inlets. They were invisible because they were disguised as something mundane, something that belonged, something that any Virginia farm would have in that location without comment. The air exchange they provided was not generous. The archaeologists calculated that the chamber's atmosphere would become uncomfortable. Elevated carbon dioxide reduced oxygen within approximately 4 hours, with 12 to 15 people occupying the space, which meant that whoever used the chamber could not remain there continuously. They had to move in and out. Someone had to manage that movement. Someone had to know when it was safe. That person, the researchers concluded, was almost certainly Silas. His assigned position, stable and grounds, gave him legitimate reason to be present at or near the stable at any hour. A stable hand working before dawn was not suspicious. A stable hand checking drainage channels after a heavy rain was not suspicious. A stable hand who knew every plank of that stable floor by touch in complete darkness was not suspicious. He had built his cover into his job description, or his job description had always been the cover. 32 years old in 1850, left-handed, a scar on his chin. 3 years, possibly 5, of silent construction. 3,000 bricks moved in the dark. The objects recovered from the chamber floor told a fragmented story of occupation. The 17 blanket fragments, when analyzed by a textile conservator at the Smithsonian in 1994, were identified as coming from at least 4 distinct blankets, meaning a minimum of 4 separate individuals had left fabric behind. The weight and weave of the wool was inconsistent with plantation-issued material of the period, which was typically coarser and lighter. These blankets had come from somewhere else, purchased, traded, stolen, passed along a network whose nodes and roots no document recorded. The ceramic vessels matched the type used in plantation kitchens throughout the Virginia Piedmont, which meant they had been removed from a kitchen context without detection. Someone with access to the Burwell House's working spaces had supplied the chamber. Someone had carried food. Someone had carried water. The water system itself was the chamber's most extraordinary engineering feature. Along the eastern wall at floor level, a shallow channel 4 inches wide, 2 inches deep, lined with the same iron-rich brick as the ventilation system, ran the full 22-foot length of the chamber and terminated in a small sump pit in the northeast corner. The channel received water from a single source, a ceramic pipe, 3/4 of an inch in diameter, that passed through the eastern wall at a point calculated to intersect with the estate's primary spring house drainage line running above. The pipe was not a tap. It did not carry pressurized water. It collected seepage, a slow, continuous trickle that the archaeologists estimated would have produced between 1 and 3 gallons per day, depending on seasonal conditions. Enough to drink. Enough barely to survive. Not enough to flood. Not enough to create dampness visible at the surface. The man who designed it had understood hydrology at a level that had no formal name in 1848, in a country that would not grant him the legal right to own the boots on his feet. The child's shoe was the detail that stayed with every researcher who handled it. Right foot, leather sole, leather upper. A simple construction with no decoration. Practical, not fine. The size was consistent with a child of 4 to 6 years. It had been worn. The sole showed wear at the ball of the foot and the outer heel. The wear pattern of a child who walked normally on hard surfaces. Someone's child had been in that chamber long enough to wear through a shoe. Someone's child had sat in 5-foot 8-inch darkness with tallow candles and wool blankets and ceramic water vessels and had waited for something. For a signal, for a season, for a man named Silas to lift the hatch and tell them it was time to move. The pine board with its nail point markings was the last object removed from the chamber, and it was the one that almost didn't survive. The conservator who lifted it from the brick shelf where it had rested for over a century noted that the wood had compressed to approximately 2/3 of its original thickness from moisture cycling, and that the nail indentations were visible only under raking light at a specific angle. She photographed it under 4 different lighting conditions before moving it. The photographs showed 47 distinct marks arranged in 6 rows. The marks were not uniform in depth, some pressed hard, some barely grazing the surface, and they were grouped in clusters of between 3 and 9 marks, separated by slightly larger intervals. They did not correspond to any alphabet. They did not correspond to any number system. They did not correspond to any known shorthand or stenographic tradition of the period. For 11 years, they corresponded to nothing at all. They were cataloged, photographed, stored in acid-free archival housing at the Virginia Historical Society, and periodically examined by researchers who left without answers. In 2004, a graduate student named Renata Ose, writing her doctoral dissertation on material culture and covert communication among enslaved communities in the antebellum South, requested access to the board. She spent 4 days with it. On the 4th day, she noticed something that every previous researcher had overlooked. The groupings of marks, when counted, produced numbers. And those numbers, when mapped against the chamber's physical dimensions, described the construction sequence. It was not a message to anyone who might find the board later. It was a builder's record. A left-handed man with a scar on his chin had pressed into a piece of pine with a nail the order in which he had built the thing he was standing inside. Wall 1, wall 2, floor, north shelf, water channel, ventilation shaft 1, ventilation shaft 2, hatch housing, counterweight system. 47 marks. Every stage of construction recorded in a system that used no language his enslavers could have read, because it used no language at all. He had kept a record. In a country that made his literacy illegal and his existence a ledger entry, he had kept a record on his own terms, in his own notation, in the only archive he could trust, a piece of wood hidden inside the thing he built. The winter of 1850 arrived early in the Culpeper Basin. By the second week of November, the Rappahannock had a skin of ice along its shallower bends, and the overnight temperatures on the Burwell estate were dropping below 20 degrees Fahrenheit before midnight. The field work was finished, the tobacco stripped, the corn cribbed, the wheat long since sold and gone north on freight wagons. For the enslaved workers on the estate, winter meant a different kind of labor: wood splitting, fence mending, equipment repair, the grinding domestic maintenance of a large property preparing itself for cold. It also meant a different kind of surveillance. In summer, the field spread people across 1,300 acres in ways that made precise accounting difficult. In winter, everyone contracted toward the central buildings. Everyone was more visible. Everyone was more watched. Silas had known this was coming. He had been calculating against it for at least 3 years. The chamber was finished by late October. The archaeologist's mortar analysis placed the final curing signature no later than the first week of November 1850, based on the temperature-dependent crystalline structure of the lime mortar in the uppermost courses of the north wall. The last bricks had been laid, the counterweight system tested, the ventilation shafts cleared of construction debris, the water channel flushed. The hatch had been lifted and lowered in darkness enough times that the pine planks above it no longer settled with any sound, distinguishable from the natural shifting of an old building in cold weather. Everything was ready. The question was not whether the chamber worked. The question was whether the network that would fill it could move without being seen. To understand the scale of what happened next, you have to understand something about the geography of flight in antebellum Virginia that most accounts of the Underground Railroad overlook entirely. The popular image of escape, a single family moving north guided by a conductor through a series of safe houses toward the Mason-Dixon line, was real, but it was not the only reality. There was another pattern, less dramatic and far less documented, that historians have called local refuge. The practice of sheltering people not hundreds of miles away, but within a few miles of where they were held, waiting out a specific danger rather than attempting a permanent journey north. A planned sale, a threatened punishment, a pregnancy that could not survive a winter march, a child too young to travel. These were not escapes in the final sense. They were acts of strategic disappearance, temporary, calculated, dependent on a precise knowledge of local terrain and a network of people willing to absorb the risk of complicity. Silas had built a local refuge. What he had built was not a way station on a route to freedom. It was a fortress of patience, designed not for transit, but for endurance. The chamber's dimensions, 11 by 22 feet, with a ceiling that permitted standing, could accommodate between 12 and 15 people for sleeping if they arranged themselves in the precise configuration that the brick shelf along the north wall suggested. Adults along the walls, children in the center, the shelf serving as a communal surface for candles and vessels, the water supply provided for survival but not comfort, the ventilation provided for consciousness but required disciplined management of flame and breath. This was not a place designed for a night or two. The wool blankets, the ceramic storage vessels, the wear pattern on a child's shoe. These were the material signatures of weeks, possibly months. 2 winters, the historical record would eventually suggest. 2 winters of 12 people living inside a space the size of a modest modern bedroom, beneath the feet of the people who owned them. The first family entered the chamber in November 1850. The researchers established this through a combination of evidence: the mortar curing date, a notation in the Burwell Estate's winter labor log that recorded 3 workers as absent presumed run, beginning November 14th, and a letter written by Harlan Burwell to his brother-in-law in Fauquier County, dated November 22nd, 1850, in which he described the disappearance in terms that revealed both his fury and his confusion. The letter, held in a private family collection and donated to the Library of Virginia in 1988, is worth examining closely. Burwell wrote that 3 of his people had gone off without cause or provocation, that he had sent riders on the northern roads as far as the Potomac without result, and that he suspected interference from the Quaker settlements toward Waterford, a reference to the community of free black residents and Quaker farmers in Loudoun County, 40 miles to the northeast, who were known in the region as a node of abolitionist activity. What Burwell did not suspect, because he had no reason to, was that the 3 people he was searching for on the roads to the Potomac were 11 feet beneath the stable floor, where his horses stood like eating hay. The 3 were a woman named in the Burwell labor inventory as Della, listed as 28 years of age and assigned to the house. Her daughter, whose name does not appear in any surviving document, and whose age the researchers estimated at 4 to 5 years based on the shoe, and a man named in the inventory as Cato, 34 years old, assigned to field work, described as stout, good worker. The connection between them was not recorded anywhere in Burwell's papers. He did not think of the people he held in bondage as having family relationships that merited documentation, but the chamber's spatial evidence suggested an intimate connection. The blanket fragments from the northern sleeping area showed 2 distinct adult fiber signatures and 1 smaller signature, positioned together, consistent with a family unit sleeping in close proximity. Della, her daughter, and Cato, 11 feet underground. While Harlan Burwell's riders searched the Potomac roads, the network that moved them into the chamber was never fully documented, for the obvious reason that documentation was the primary danger. What the researchers reconstructed, over decades of cross-referencing estate records, county documents, and the sparse surviving correspondence of free black communities in the Culpeper region, was a structure built on proximity and task. Silas was not the only person who knew about the chamber. He could not have been. The movement of 3 people across a winter farmyard, through a stable, down through a hatch in the floor, that required watchers at the periphery, someone to check the position of the house lights, someone to account for the movements of the Burwell family and the white overseer whose name appears in the estate records as J.T. Mallory. It required coordination. It required trust, distributed across at minimum 4 or 5 people who had made the calculation that the risk of collective action was lower than the risk of exposure through isolation. The overseer, Mallory, is the figure who appears most often in the Burwell correspondence as an active threat. He was not a resident of the estate. He lived in a rented room in Culpeper Town, 4 miles distant, and rode out to the property each morning at a time that varied by season and by his own habits. His unpredictability was the network's primary operational problem. A man who arrived at 7 in the morning every day could be planned around. A man who sometimes arrived at 5:30 and sometimes at 9, who sometimes made a second visit in the late afternoon and sometimes did not, who sometimes entered the stable to inspect the horses and sometimes went directly to the fields. That man was a variable that could not be fully controlled. The ventilation schedule that the chamber's design implied, the need to manage flame and air consumption across a population of 12 to 15 people, required knowing when Mallory was on the property. Someone had to watch for him. Someone had to have a signal system that communicated his presence and absence without using language, without making sound, across a distance of several hundred yards. The researchers found evidence of that signal system in the most mundane object on the estate, a water bucket. An 1851 notation in Burwell's account book, the kind of obsessive property accounting that plantation owners kept to document every expenditure, recorded the replacement of a wooden water bucket at the stable yard, well, the original having gone to pieces. The replacement bucket was noted as being painted with a red pitch stripe for identification purposes. A second notation 6 weeks later recorded that the stripe had been painted over in black per the stableman's request as the color was fading. The stableman, Silas. He had changed the bucket's appearance, and the account book recorded it as maintenance. What it was almost certainly was a binary signal. Red stripe visible at the well meant Mallory was on the property. Black painted bucket at the well meant the path was clear. A water bucket that anyone could see and no one would question. A signal system hidden inside a chore. The second family entered the chamber in January 1851, and this movement created the greatest risk the network had yet faced. January on a Virginia farm was the month of inventory. Harlan Burwell, like most plantation owners of his class and period, conducted a formal accounting of his property at the start of each new year. Equipment was inspected and logged. Stores were measured, and people were counted. A January inventory with 2 families absent, 5 people gone from a workforce of 34, would not produce the same response as a November disappearance blamed on roadrunners heading north. A January absence meant someone still on the property knew where they were. It meant searching inward rather than outward. The January 1851 Burwell inventory has survived. It is a 4-page document in Harlan Burwell's own hand, and it is, in one specific and extraordinary detail, wrong. The count of people on the property is listed as 32. The 1850 labor inventory listed 34. 2 individuals are effectively absent from the January count, yet there is no notation of additional runaways, no letter to the brother-in-law, no report to the county sheriff. 32 people counted and recorded, at least 14 people living on that property at that moment, if the chamber was at capacity. The discrepancy is 2, not 5, which means that whoever conducted the physical count, the overseer Mallory, walking through the quarters on a January morning, was either incompetent, distracted, or had been managed. The researchers spent considerable time on this question and arrived at a cautious conclusion. The count had been manipulated. Someone in the quarters had presented Mallory with a number that matched expectation closely enough not to trigger scrutiny. not a perfect count, a plausible count. The specific skill of making an absence invisible by making a smaller absence look like the whole story. This was not Silas's skill. This was someone else in the network. Someone with daily proximity to Mallory. Someone whose role gave them contact with the overseer during the counting process. The labor inventory listed one individual assigned to what it described as house and accounts assistants. A man named Edmund, 41 years old, described as able to cipher. In antebellum Virginia, an enslaved person described as able to cipher, able to perform basic arithmetic, was an extraordinary asset to a plantation owner. Burwell used Edmund to help maintain his account books. He trusted Edmund with numbers because Edmund's numerical competence was valuable to him. And that trust had calcified over years into something Burwell experienced as reliability. He did not consider that a man who could manipulate numbers on his behalf could manipulate numbers against him with equal facility. In January 1851, Edmund gave Mallory a count of 32, and Mallory wrote down 32, and Harlan Burwell signed his inventory and filed it in his account book and went to bed satisfied that he knew what he owned. He did not know what he owned. What he owned was a network. By the second week of February 1851, the chamber held 12 people. The researchers established this number through a convergence of evidence, the blanket fiber analysis, which identified a minimum of 9 distinct adult textile signatures. The ceramic vessel capacity, which could store sufficient food and water for between 10 and 14 individuals over a multi-day period, and a single line in a letter written by a free black woman named Patience Greer, living in the town of Culpeper, to her sister in Philadelphia, dated March 1851. The letter, recovered from the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society archive in 1971 and cross-referenced with the Burwell case by Renata Ose in her 2004 dissertation, referred obliquely to 12 souls kept warm through February by the work of one quiet man. It was the only external confirmation of the chamber's occupancy that the researchers ever found. One line, written carefully in language that told everything to someone who knew where to look and nothing to someone who didn't. Patience Greer knew. She was part of something. Her precise role was never established. The physical conditions inside the chamber during February 1851 require a careful accounting because they reveal both the ingenuity of the design and the extremity of the endurance required. 12 people in 11 by 22 feet of enclosed space. 5 feet, 8 inches of ceiling height. Daytime temperatures in the Culpeper Basin during February 1851 were recorded at the University of Virginia's weather station, then newly established, as ranging between 18 and 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The chamber's underground position provided thermal insulation. The researchers estimated an interior temperature of between 42 and 50 degrees, assuming no flame. With candles burning, the 3 tallow stubs recovered from the shelf were the remnants of a supply that had to have been substantially larger. The temperature could be raised to perhaps 55 or 58 degrees. Cold. Consistently, numbingly cold, but survivable. The wool blankets of above standard weight that someone had sourced from outside the plantation's standard supply, those blankets were not incidental to the survival calculation. They were load-bearing elements of it. The air management discipline required under those conditions was severe. 12 people breathing in an enclosed space consume oxygen and produce carbon dioxide at a rate that the chamber's ventilation system, designed for passive seepage exchange, could only partially address. Candles had to be managed, burned in rotation rather than continuously, limited to periods of necessary activities such as eating, attending to the child, or navigating the space. Long stretches of darkness, long stretches of silence. The ventilation shafts discharged into the stable yard drainage channel, and any significant sound from below could potentially travel upward through those 5-inch ceramic pipes and emerge at the surface. 12 people maintaining near silence for days at a time. A child between 4 and 6 years old, maintaining near silence. That detail, the child, is the one that recurs in every researcher's account of the case. Not as a logistical problem, but as a human one. Someone had taught that child something. Someone had explained, in terms a 4-year-old could hold, that silence was the condition of survival, that the dark was not to be feared, that the cold was temporary, that the man who came to the hatch and lifted it and passed food down through the opening, that man was to be trusted absolutely because he had built this place with his hands, and his hands knew what they were doing. The child's shoe wore through at the ball of the foot and the outer heel, the wear pattern of a child who walked normally. That child had walked in that chamber, back and forth, 22 feet in one direction, 22 feet back, in darkness, or by the light of a managed tallow candle wearing a shoe that was wearing out, while 12 people breathed carefully and waited. Silas came to the hatch at intervals that the network signal system governed. The water bucket at the well communicated Mallory's presence or absence. A second signal. The researchers identified it from a pattern in Burwell's stable maintenance log, which recorded the stable's large exterior lantern as being hung on its post hook on some evenings and stored inside on others, apparently at the stable hand's discretion based on weather conditions, communicated the safety window for the hatch to be opened. Lantern on the post, clear. Lantern stored inside, wait. He had built 2 independent signal layers into the operation. If the bucket signal was missed or misread, the lantern signal provided a redundant confirmation. If both signals cleared, he opened the hatch. He passed down food, water replenishment for the ceramic vessels, candle replacements. He received waste material that had to be disposed of without leaving any trace that could be associated with the stable's floor. He listened for anything that needed to be communicated upward, a medical concern, a change in the child's condition, a request. He did all of this in the dark, in the cold, in the narrow window of time between Mallory's departure and his potential return. And then he closed the hatch, relaid the pine planks, and went back to being Silas, stable hand, tall left-handed, scar on the chin, one line in a labor inventory. The first crisis came in late February. Burwell's account book recorded the purchase of additional stable hay on February 24th, 1851, to be delivered by wagon from a neighboring farm. A routine transaction, but one that brought 2 unknown men onto the property, with a loaded wagon requiring unloading directly into the stable. The hay delivery required the stable floor to be cleared of animals and equipment. It required the presence of the delivery men inside the stable for an estimated 2 to 3 hours. and it required Silas to be present throughout, to direct the storage of the hay, to move the horses, to manage the space in a way that kept two strangers' attention on the hay and not on the floor. He could not change the signal. The bucket sat at the well with its black pitch overstripe. Mallory was absent, but two unfamiliar men were in the stable, stacking hay over the section of floor above the hatch, walking across the pine planks repeatedly with the weight of full hay bales, not 4 feet from where 12 people lay in controlled silence beneath their feet. The delivery took 2 hours and 40 minutes, based on the account book notation of payment for a half-day's labor. 2 hours and 40 minutes of heavy footsteps directly over the chamber ceiling. 2 hours and 40 minutes of men's voices, of hay chaff falling through the plank gaps, of the normal noise of a working farm settling through the floorboards into the space below. No one made a sound. The hatch did not move. The delivery men left. Silas swept the stable floor, moved the horses back into their stalls, checked the pine planks, and set the lantern on its post hook. The chamber was clear. It had held. But the hay that the delivery men had stacked now partially blocked the hatch. Not completely. Silas had managed the placement well enough to leave a workable margin, but enough that the counterweight system operated under additional resistance. Enough that opening the hatch from below now required more force, and more force meant more sound. He had 3 days to solve it before the next scheduled provisioning. He solved it by restacking the hay over the following 2 evenings, working alone by lantern light, half a bale at a time, recording nothing and telling no one, moving hay quietly in the dark until the hatch margin was restored. Edmund in the house adjusted the account book's hay storage notation to reflect a slightly different stacking configuration, a change so minor that Burwell never questioned it, a change that existed in a plantation ledger for 171 years before anyone thought to read it as evidence of a cover-up. The second crisis was the one that nearly ended everything. In the first week of March 1851, Harlan Burwell sold a horse. This was a common transaction. Burwell traded horses regularly. But this particular sale required the buyer, a man from Madison County named Creel, to inspect the animal in the stable before completing the purchase. Creel arrived with his own stableman, a man whose name appears nowhere in the Burwell records. This second man, Creel's stableman, walked the length of the stable examining the horse, tapping the walls for soundness, testing the floor for rot. He was doing his job. He was checking the structural integrity of the building that housed the animal his employer was considering purchasing. He was a professional and he was thorough, and at some point in his inspection he knelt down and pressed his palm flat against the pine floor planks near the eastern wall and held it there for several seconds. He said nothing. He stood up. He completed his inspection. Creel purchased the horse. The 2 men left. Silas was present for the entire inspection. He had no control over what Creel's stableman felt when he pressed his hand to the floor. He could not have known whether the man felt the faint warmth differential, the slightly elevated temperature of planks above an occupied space, or whether he had simply been checking for soft wood. He could not have known what the man thought or what he would do with whatever he thought. He knew only that a stranger had pressed his palm to the floor 12 inches from the hatch seam and held it there for several seconds, and then stood up and walked away. That night, Silas made a decision that the researcher spent years debating. He opened the hatch and told the people below that they were going to move. Not north. Not yet. Not all of them. But the inner ring of the group, the 3 people who had been in the chamber longest and who were the most immediately at risk from Burwell's continued searching. Della, her daughter, and Cato would leave the chamber that night and be moved to a different location, a secondary refuge, the nature of which no document has ever revealed. The remaining 9 people would stay. He had built the chamber with an exit strategy he had never written down, because writing it down was the one thing that could have destroyed everything. The night Della, her daughter, and Cato left the chamber, the temperature dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Silas had chosen the date deliberately, not despite the cold, but because of it. In 11-degree weather, the overseer Mallory did not make his early ride. Burwell's correspondence from that winter repeatedly mentioned Mallory's habit of arriving late on the coldest mornings, stopping first at a tavern in Culpeper Town to warm himself before riding out to the estate. Silas had observed this pattern across 2 winters. He had filed it away the way he filed everything away, without paper, without notation, entirely inside a mind that had learned to treat observation as its only reliable archive. Mallory's cold weather tardiness was not a coincidence he was exploiting. It was a variable he had spent 2 years waiting to use. They moved at 3 in the morning. 3 people, a child, carried silent against an adult chest, crossing a frozen farmyard in darkness so complete that the route had to be memorized rather than seen. The researchers never established with certainty where they went. The secondary refuge Silas had prepared left no physical evidence that survived to the 20th century. What the records showed was a gap. Della's name did not appear in any Virginia document after March 1851. Cato's name did not appear. The child's name had never appeared anywhere at all. They crossed that farmyard in 11-degree darkness, and the documentary record closed behind them, like ice reforming over a hole. What happened to them after that is one of the case's 2 permanent mysteries. The other permanent mystery is what happened to Silas. He appears in the Burwell records for the last time in an account book entry dated April 3, 1852. The entry is unremarkable. A notation of stable equipment repair, a new hinge purchased for the stable's large door, labor attributed to the stable man. 16 words in a plantation account book. After that date, his name, or rather, the designation that stood in for his name, does not appear again. There is no runaway notice in the Culpeper County records for the spring of 1852. There is no sale record, no transfer notation, no death record. He does not appear in the 1860 slave schedule for Culpeper County under any physical description matching his own. He does not appear in the Freedmen's Bureau records for Virginia after the war. Records that, while incomplete, captured the names and histories of thousands of formerly enslaved people who came forward to register marriages, establish family connections, and claim the legal identity that emancipation had theoretically granted them. Silas, tall, left-handed, scar on the chin, simply stopped appearing. In the spring of 1852, in a county where an enslaved person's disappearance was a financial loss that virtually guaranteed documentary follow-up, he vanished without generating a single piece of paper. The researchers found this deeply strange. Not the disappearance itself. People escaped, people died. People were sold privately in transactions that sometimes went unrecorded in county books. What was strange was the silence around the disappearance. Burwell had written to his brother-in-law about 3 missing workers in November 1850 with visible outrage. He had sent riders to the Potomac. When Silas disappeared in the spring of 1852, Harlan Burwell wrote nothing, filed nothing, reported nothing. The man who had maintained a stable on his property for at least 7 years, who had been listed in his own labor inventory, who had been a line item in his account books through 4 consecutive years, that man stopped existing, and Burwell did not put a single word to paper about it. Either Burwell did not know Silas was gone, or Burwell knew exactly what had happened and chose, for reasons of his own, not to say so. The answer came not from Virginia but from Ohio, and it came 142 years late. In 1994, a retired school teacher in Oberlin, Ohio, named Marcus Greer, a descendant of Patience Greer, the free black woman in Culpeper, whose 1851 letter had contained the phrase, 12 souls kept warm through February by the work of one quiet man, donated a collection of family papers to the Oberlin College archive. The collection was modest: letters, a few photographs, a marriage certificate, and a small leather-bound notebook that had been passed through 4 generations of the Greer family with the description, oral and consistent, that it had belonged to the builder. No one in the family knew precisely what that meant. The notebook had been treated as an heirloom whose specific significance had blurred across generations into a general reverence. Something important, something old, something not to be thrown away. Renata Ose requested access to the notebook in the fall of 2004, 9 months after she had decoded the Pine Board's construction record. She examined it over 3 days in the Oberlin Archive reading room. What she found inside it was not a diary, not a letter, not any form of conventional written record. It was 34 pages of the same nail-point notation system she had decoded in the Virginia chamber. The same clustering pattern, the same variable pressure depths, the same spatial groupings that she had identified as a construction sequence. But this notebook was not a construction record. It was something far more significant and far more difficult to decode, because it was not about a building, it was about people. It took Ose 14 months to work through it fully, in collaboration with 2 colleagues, a linguist specializing in Creole communication systems, and an archaeologist with expertise in material culture of the antebellum period. What they eventually established, published in a 2006 journal article that received almost no mainstream attention and was cited primarily within academic circles, was this: the notebook contained the encoded records of 34 individual people. Not names in any European linguistic sense, the notation system had no alphabet, no phonetic component, but identity markers. Specific combinations of marks that, cross-referenced against physical descriptions, locations, and movement sequences also encoded in the notebook, corresponded to 34 distinct individuals whose movements Silas had tracked, managed, and in many cases facilitated between approximately 1848 and 1852. 34 people. Not 12. Not the families in the chamber. 34 people over 4 years, moved through a network whose nodes extended from Culpeper County northward through Loudoun County, across the Potomac, at two specific crossing points, both identified in the notebook by landmark descriptions encoded in the notation system, and into the free black communities of southern Ohio, where Patience Greer's correspondence network received them and absorbed them. The chamber beneath the Burwell stable was not the whole operation. It was the engine at the center of a larger machine. The notebook also contained, in its final 12 pages, something the researchers had not anticipated: a record of Silas himself. Not his origin, that remained unknown, and the notebook's personal section offered no birthplace, no family of origin, no account of how he came to be on the Burwell estate. What it offered was a record of his skill acquisition. In the same nail-point notation, he had documented how he had learned what he knew: the brickwork first. The iron-rich bricks in the chamber's ventilation system, the ones that matched plantation kiln production, had come from the Ashby farm, where two men designated as brick and lime workers were held in bondage. Their names, in Silas's notation system, were identifiable as two of the 34 individuals he had moved through the network. He had not simply sourced bricks from them, he had learned from them, across a period the notebook suggested was approximately 18 months. He had visited the Ashby farm under the cover of interstate errands, the kind of routine contact between neighboring plantations that overseers tracked loosely, if at all, and had received instruction in brick bonding, mortar composition, and load-bearing wall construction from two men who had been practicing the trade for years. He had no formal context for what he was learning. He had no vocabulary for the physics involved. What he had was a set of hands that felt the difference between a properly set course and an improperly set one, and a memory that retained the feeling permanently. The hydrology he had worked out himself. The notebook contained what appeared to be a series of observational records: water movement patterns across the estate, noted over multiple seasons; drainage channel behavior documented across wet and dry periods; the seepage rate of the spring line that his water channel eventually tapped. He had studied the estate's water behavior the way an engineer studies a survey map, except his survey instruments were his own eyes and a stick pressed into mud to measure depth. He had no drainage tables, no hydraulic calculations, no professional framework. He had years of watching water move through ground, and the understanding, arrived at through pure observation, that water follows the path of least resistance, and that a carefully positioned ceramic pipe in the right location becomes part of that path. The water channel in the chamber worked because he had spent years learning how water moved on that specific piece of land before he built anything to intercept it. The ventilation system, the most technically sophisticated element of the chamber, had come from a source that the notebook identified but the researchers found difficult to verify directly. The notation suggested that Silas had encountered at some point before 1848 a man who had worked in a commercial coal mine. The specific mine was not identifiable from the notation, but coal mining in Virginia in the 1840s was concentrated primarily in the Richmond Basin, 75 miles to the southeast, and the Chesterfield County coal mines of that period used enslaved labor extensively. The notebook suggested a single extended conversation, possibly at a Culpeper County gathering, of the kind that enslaved people sometimes managed to organize at the edges of permitted Sunday movement. A coal miner who understood shaft ventilation as a survival technology, a stable hand who was building something that needed air. One conversation, at most two. Enough. The man who built that chamber had assembled his knowledge from the most dispersed and unofficial curriculum imaginable. Brick workers on a neighboring farm, water patterns studied across 4 seasons, a single conversation with a coal miner, whose name he recorded in a notation system that no one would decode for 150 years. He had no library, no mentor in any formal sense, no institution, no credential. He had the oldest and most durable of all engineering tools, the sustained attention of a mind that refused to waste what it observed. The question of why Silas disappeared without generating documentation, the silence in the Burwell records that the researchers had found so strange, was answered by the notebook's final 3 pages. They were the most personal section of the entire document, and they were the hardest to decode because the notation system shifted in those pages in a way that suggested either deliberate obscuring or intense emotional pressure affecting the consistency of the marks. Osei spent 6 weeks on those 3 pages alone. What they contained was a record of a confrontation. In the early spring of 1852, Harlan Burwell had discovered something. Not the chamber. The chamber itself remained undetected. What Burwell discovered was Edmund's manipulation of the January 1851 inventory count. The discovery came not through Burwell's own perception, but through Mallory's. The overseer, cross-referencing a new spring inventory against the previous year's numbers, had noticed a discrepancy in the hay storage notations that Edmund had adjusted. A minor discrepancy, the kind that might have been dismissed as a clerical error under other circumstances. But Mallory was not in the habit of being generous with his interpretations. He brought the discrepancy to Burwell and described it as evidence of deliberate falsification. Burwell confronted Edmund. What Edmund said in that confrontation was not recorded. Burwell's account books did not capture spoken words. What the account books captured was the consequence. Edmund was sold. Within 3 weeks of the discrepancy's discovery, he was gone from the Burwell estate, transferred to a trader in Culpeper Town, and from there into a chain of sales whose subsequent records Osei tracked as far as a tobacco plantation in Pittsylvania County, before losing the thread. Edmund, the man who could cipher, who had given Mallory a plausible count in January 1851 and adjusted a hay storage notation and held the network's paper layer together with the precision of a man who understood that numbers could be weapons. Edmund was sold south. He was gone before he could be questioned further. He was gone before Burwell understood fully what he had been part of. Silas understood what Edmund's sale meant. It meant the margin was closing. Burwell did not yet know about the chamber or the network's full extent. If he had known, the response would have been catastrophic and extensively documented, and no such documentation existed. But Burwell was now suspicious in a way he hadn't been before. He was looking at his property with different eyes, and Silas had built something extraordinary directly beneath those eyes, and it had held for 4 years, and the probability of it continuing to hold against a newly suspicious overseer and a plantation owner whose trust in his own accounting had just been violated was not something Silas was willing to calculate optimistically. He left in April 1852. The notebook's final entries were dated, insofar as the notation's seasonal markers could be interpreted as dates, to the first week of April. The last entry was a single mark, pressed deeply into the page in a way that Osei described as qualitatively different from every other mark in the notebook. Harder, more deliberate, as if the point had been pressed and held for a moment before being withdrawn. A period, she called it, in the absence of a better term. A full stop. He crossed the Potomac at one of the two crossing points his own notebook had documented. He arrived in southern Ohio sometime in the spring or summer of 1852, received by the same network that had received 33 people before him. Patience Greer's correspondence with her sister in Philadelphia, examined in full by Osei, contained one more relevant line, a letter dated August 1852 that referred to the builder himself, arrived at last in good health, somewhat older looking than expected for his years. He was received. He was known. The network he had built and managed for 4 years had been carrying people toward a place that could receive them, and when it was finally his turn to be carried, it received him too. His name after Ohio. Whether he took a surname, whether he registered with the Freedmen's Bureau after the war, whether he had children who carried his notation system or his memory forward, was never established. The Oberlin Archive contains his notebook. The Virginia Historical Society contains his pine board. The ground outside Culpeper, Virginia, contains the ghost of his brickwork, excavated and reburied after the 1993 archaeological survey, marked with a small aluminum survey stake that is not visible from the road. The suppression of this story was not a single act. It was not a decision made in a room by identifiable people with a specific agenda. It was something more mundane and more durable. It was the cumulative effect of a record-keeping system designed to render certain people invisible, operating for long enough that the invisibility became structural. Harlan Burwell did not record Silas's disappearance because an enslaved person's disappearance without financial consequence, without a sale, without a recapture, without a runaway notice generating reward expenditure, was simply not an event that the plantation accounting system had a category for. The system recorded losses. Silas's departure was not processed as a loss because Burwell did not fully understand what he had lost. He had lost the most sophisticated logistical mind on his property and possibly in his county. He recorded nothing because the system he operated within had no field for that entry. The county sheriff who visited Gerald Pitts's excavation in 1961 and wrote 4 sentences in a notebook did not suppress the chamber's discovery with malicious intent. He was a man operating within a social and institutional context that did not prompt him to treat the underground chamber beneath a collapsed plantation stable as historically significant. He saw a hole in the ground. He wrote 4 sentences. He told Pitts to finish the job. The photograph sat in a shoebox for 31 years because there was no mechanism, no institution, no framework, no sufficiently interested party with sufficient access to move them from a shoebox to an archive in less time than that. The 2006 journal article that Renata Osei published with her colleagues received no mainstream press coverage. It was cited 23 times in academic literature over the following decade. A respectable number within its field, invisible outside it. The notebook remained in the Oberlin Archive, accessible to any researcher who requested it, known to perhaps 40 people who had a professional reason to know about it. The pine board remained in acid-free housing in Richmond. The aluminum survey stake stood in the ground outside Culpeper. None of this was conspiracy. All of it was silence. The difference matters because conspiracy can be exposed and prosecuted and resolved. Silence is self-perpetuating. Silence is what happens when the system that generates the record also determines whose actions merit recording. Silas built a chamber that held 12 people through 2 winters, managed a network that moved 34 people to freedom across 4 years, encoded the entire operation in a notation system of his own invention, and left a notebook that a graduate student decoded in an Ohio archive a century and a half after he pressed its final mark into the last page. The reason his name is not in any textbook, the reason his chamber is not a national landmark, the reason this story requires a 150-year chain of archival accident and dedicated scholarship to be told at all. The reason is not that the story was hidden. The reason is that no one with the power to make it visible ever decided it was worth the trouble. Renata Ose decided it was worth the trouble. Gerald Pitts kept 11 photographs in a shoebox and did not throw them away. Patience Greer wrote one careful line in a letter to her sister and her descendant, kept the family papers for 4 generations. Marcus Greer carried a leather notebook to an archive instead of a landfill. A child wore through a shoe, walking 22 feet back and forth in the dark, and someone preserved that shoe in a ceramic vessel, and the vessel did not break, and the ground did not flood, and the building did not burn, and the story survived by the narrowest possible margin of material and human luck. 3,000 bricks, 1 stable hand, tall, left-handed, scar on the chin. He built it with his hands. He ran it with his mind. He saved 34 lives with the knowledge he assembled from brick workers and water patterns and a single conversation with a coal miner in a country that made his literacy illegal and his personhood a ledger entry. His name was Silas. His name was... It is the only name he was permitted to have, and it is the name this story ends with, because it is the only one the record preserved. And the record, for all its failures, for all its silences, for all the things it chose not to see, preserved that much. Silas, 1 name, 34 lives, 3,000 bricks, and a notebook in Ohio that nobody opened for 150 years, waiting for someone who knew how to read it.